Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for tonight's history highlights on wartime upstanders. I'm Dr. Sara Abosch-Jacobson. I am the Chief Education Officer at the museum, and we are also going to be joined by Dr. Charlotte Decoster, who is our Senior Director of Education at the museum. And we are going to be talking about and featuring 3 different wartime upstanders, all of whom are featured in our special upstander wall and gallery in our American Ideals, Reality, and Repair section. Before we begin, I wanted to thank our sponsors and supporters for this evening. We have Agape Clinic, Green Hill School, SMU Human Rights Program, Southwest Jewish Congress, the Legacy Senior Communities, and Temple Shalom. And it's really, really wonderful that they're able to sponsor us. We couldn't host programs like this without support from groups like this. So I would like to ask Charlotte Decoster to join us. And Charlotte, can you kick us off, please?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Before we deep dive into our Texas upstanders who are, did so much work when it comes to veterans, we just wanted to briefly refresh and remind everybody of what it means to be an upstander. As a history museum, we look beyond just the facts of the history, and we really look at what we can learn from that history, and especially the human behavior that we witness within that history. And so for us at the museum, we view an upstander as a person who stands up for other people and their rights, a person who combats injustice, inequality, or unfairness. And when they see something wrong, they work to make it right. We always like to pair that a little bit with our concept of being a bystander, which is really embodied in the quote that we have actually in our orientation theater at the museum by Dr. Albert Einstein, who said, actually in reference to the Spanish Civil War, the world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing. And so I think frequently in a world of where there's many bystanders, today we are going to look at 3 upstanders that are featured on our Texas Upstander wall in our Pivot to America wing that really embody that concept of being an upstander. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Abosch for our very first upstander.
Thank you, Charlotte. So we're going to start this evening by talking about Dory Miller. And Doris Miller was born on October 12th, 1919, and he was born in Waco, Texas. He was born to 2 sharecropper parents, Connery and Henrietta Miller. And he was the third of 4 boys, and he experienced a fairly poor economically upbringing, although it was rich. His parents took the best care of him that they possibly could. He worked the family's subsistence farm. He also worked in Waco as a cook's assistant. And by the time he made it to high school, he went to A.J. Moore in Waco. He was the school's fullback. Now, he was a big young man. But they say by the time he was 17 or 18 years old, he was 6'3" and more than 200 pounds. And the first thing that we frequently hear from students is why Doris? And the story in his family is that the midwife who delivered him at home convinced his mother that she was going, because she'd had boys, that she was going to give birth to a girl. And so they chose the name Doris because of the midwife, and Doris did not come out as a girl, but the name stuck with him. The Dory people think, historians think, probably came actually from a misspelling of his name, but it stuck with him. And so Dory became the nickname by which he went. He went to high school in Waco, as I said, but he never finished. He dropped out of school when he was between the age of 17 and 18. He had been forced to repeat a grade. He didn't want to do that. He kicked around Waco for a bit, still, working with his parents and picking up odd jobs. And then in 1939, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy, and he enlisted in the Navy at the Naval Station in Dallas. From there, he went to basic training, and ultimately he was assigned to the USS West Virginia, which was a ship that was based out of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. When he made it to that ship, he was serving as a mess attendant on the ship. I don't know if you all know this, but throughout virtually all of World War II, it was very hard for African Americans to make it above the level of floating, bellhops, busboys, waiters, second level cooks, and that was deliberate. The military was segregated, and it wasn't believed that blacks had the ability to serve in combat units in these times. Miller proves the lie to that, and I'll share that story with you now. And this is why we talk about him being just an amazing upstander. So first of all, let's start with the fact that he enlists in 39. He's not drafted. He makes a decision to serve his country. So let's start there. He goes into the Navy, as I said. He's stationed in Pearl Harbor on the USS West Virginia. And he got up around 5 or 6 in the morning on September 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor Day. He didn't know that. And he got up. He was a mess assistant, so he went and served breakfast, then began collecting laundry. And almost at just before 8 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese started bombing Pearl Harbor. His ship got hit by 7 torpedoes, including one that smashed through the deck. And so he immediately headed for his battle station. As he headed toward his battle station, what he realized is that the battle station no longer existed. It had been blown apart. So he started making his way up to a central area in the ship that was frequently referred to as Grand Central, because it's where 2 different directions in the ship intersected. And at that spot, he ran into Lieutenant Commander Johnson, who was the ship's communications officer, who asked him to come up to the conning tower, so the area at the top of the ship where the command frequently sits, and to help move the ship's captain. The ship's captain had been severely wounded. Doris Miller and another sailor on the ship couldn't get him out of the conning tower area because they were under fire. So they moved him so that he was out of the direct line of fire. The head of the ship, his name was Mervyn Benyon, ultimately dies on the ship from his wounds, but refuses to leave the ship, refuses to leave his men. As he dies, Dory Miller is directed to go down and to help load weapons into a 50 ammunition into a 50 caliber machine gun. He had no training on this. African Americans, because they were not expected to fight, not even they weren't expected to fight, they weren't permitted to fight, were not trained on these weapons. And so what happened is he, along with another sailor, went down to these guns. The other sailor showed him how to load the deck gun, assuming that Dory Miller would load the gun and that he would fire it. And the other sailor went to the other gun. When the other sailor turned around, when he finished loading his gun, what he saw was that Dory Miller was firing at approaching Japanese planes. And so Miller manned this gun until they ran out of ammunition, as did the other man. There's some thought to the fact that Miller may have shot down anywhere from 1 to about 4 planes. It's never been completely documented, but the thought is that if not that, he definitely did damage to the approaching planes. Once he ran out of ammunition, he stayed on board and started helping his fellow sailors get off board because it was apparent that the ship was going to go down. He was one of the last men to leave the ship, and he swam for shore. Incredibly heroic action. Nothing is written about this initially, other than coverage in some of the papers around the country that say that there was using the terminology of the time, there was a Negro sailor who manned a gun, and nobody knew who it was. Flash forward to early 42, and it becomes clear that it was an African-American sailor named Dory Miller. And it is the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a long-standing Black paper, that broke the story. On the basis of their breaking of the story, people began to agitate in the United States for Miller to receive a medal. And in fact, there were some who wanted him to receive the National Medal of Honor. There was blockage in Congress keeping him from getting that medal. Ultimately, he was awarded for his heroic actions the Navy Cross. And what you see in the bottom right photo here is Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller receiving the Navy Cross from Admiral Nimitz. I mean, this was a big deal. And Nimitz came specifically to award him that medal. That was May 27, 1942. And on that same day, in the upper left-hand corner here, you see Dory Miller wearing his medal. And you see the USS West Virginia the day at Pearl there. For those of you who aren't familiar with the history, the USS West Virginia does sink on the 7th, but it sinks in shallow water, and it is refloated within the next year or so, and it is fixed, and it goes back out to sea and fights throughout the rest of the war. Dory Miller is brought back from the next ship that he's assigned to in later 42 to begin a war bonds trip in the United States to sell war bonds. Now, this was always done with whites who were recognized as having been heroic in combat and having been made a name for themselves in the newspapers. This was not done for Blacks ever. And it was a tribute to the Pittsburgh Courier and other African-American papers around the country who began agitating for Miller to come and to attempt to recruit men to the military, and also to raise money for the U.S. efforts. And this is another sample of Miller's upstander behavior, because what he was doing was fighting an early version of what's called the Double V for Victory campaign. Victory overseas against the forces of fascism, victory at home against the forces of racism and segregation. I wish I had a happier ending to this story. However, he was reassigned, he was promoted, he ended up becoming a cook, and he was reassigned to a ship that was sent out to the Gilbert Islands. They were involved in a campaign in the Gilbert Islands. The ship was the Liscombe Bay, and that ship was torpedoed on November 24th, actually the day after hostilities in the area ended. It was hit by a single Japanese torpedo. That torpedo, unfortunately, hit the area where the munitions and the torpedoes of Liscombe Bay were held, and the entire ship sunk within 23 minutes. I mean, it went down fast. Of the 960 some odd men in the crew, only 272 survived, and unfortunately, Doris Miller was not one of them. So Miller passed away at the age of 24, fighting for his country. The final thing that I'll show you before we flip to the next page, and you'll hear Orson Welles talking about Doris Miller and what he did, is a photo of a Ford class aircraft carrier. The first steel, like a 10-inch cut of steel for it, was done in 2021. This Ford class aircraft carrier will take to sea in 2032, so 11 years after the first steel cut was done, and it will be named the USS Doris Miller. It is the first aircraft carrier to be named after a Black man. It is the first aircraft carrier to be named after a non-president in decades. This is a big deal, and it's the newest nuclear class. And so that also speaks to how people view Dory Miller. Charlotte, can we have the next page, and we can do the Orson Welles video.
Doris Miller, ship's cook, third class Doris Miller, United States Navy. Lost at sea, 24 November 1943, in the sinking of the Liscombe Bay. When on the 7th of December 1941, a certain memorable attack occurred at Pearl Harbor, Doris was serving as a mess attendant, second class, aboard the battleship Arizona. A Naval Reserve lieutenant and Doris manned a pair of machine guns and fired upon the attacking planes which were strafing and bombing the ship unmercifully. Doris and the lieutenant are said to have shot down 8 enemy planes. The exact figure has never been substantiated, but what has been substantiated, and this without question, is that Doris Miller, as a Negro messman, had never been trained in gunnery. I'm very happy to report that naval training procedures have since been altered. For distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his personal safety, Doris was awarded the Navy Cross. Doris got home to Waco just once after that on a 30-day leave, and was subsequently lost on the Liscombe Bay.
Charlotte?
So I have the honor to introduce to you Héctor P. Garcia, or Héctor Perez Garcia, probably one of the people in Texas that made the biggest difference when it comes to veterans' rights and supporting them. But I want to start with a description of Garcia, of Dr. Garcia, of how he really became known, and this saying that went around about him, that he was a man who in 1 week delivers 20 babies, 20 speeches, and 20,000 votes. And that just describes the man that Garcia was. And I wonder if he ever slept. If you just read his biography, all the things that he did and what he was involved with just to make a difference in his community was amazing. Garcia was born in Mexico in 1914, the son of a professor and a teacher. And I think that had immense influence on him and his siblings. In 1917, they fled Mexico because of the violence with the Mexican Revolution, and they settled in Texas, in Mercedes, Texas. There, his family actually joined working in a dry goods store, leaving behind his father's long career in education and his mother's as well. Immediately, Garcia became very involved in his school community, and especially with the Citizens Military Training Corps, which was really the predecessor of what is today known as the ROTC. And that was really his introduction to the military world. Within the year, just being a young man at 16 years old, he was already considered an officer in the U.S. Army because of his training within that. In 1932, he graduated high school. And at this point, this was still a segregated high school in Mercedes, Texas, only for Mexican-American children considered at this point. He moved to Austin eventually after a short time getting credits at the community college, and got his degree at the University of Texas in zoology. Later, he went for his medical degree at the University of Texas, Galveston. And this is really important at that point because there were still quotas of how many Latin students could enter into medical degrees. And because of that quotas, he was the only Latin student in the degree program at UT Galveston. After he graduated there, he immediately enlisted again with World War II having started and the U.S. having joined the war. He went on active duty, starting as an infantry officer. And you can actually see a picture of him right here in 1944 in his uniform. Having his medical degree at this point too, he quickly moved forward, joining the medical corps as an officer and a surgeon as well, being stationed in North Africa and Italy. And you can actually see Dr. Garcia's medical unit here being photographed in North Africa at this point. It is also during this time period at the end in 1945 that he will meet his wife, Dr. Wanda Facillo, then in 1945 returns back to Texas. Eventually, his first daughter and his wife will join him in Texas as well. When he returns back home, he joins his brother in a medical practice in Corpus Christi. And this is really where we see the difference that Garcia comes out, not just being coming back and being a medical doctor, but using that degree to make a difference in his community. Actually became known as Doctor de Barrios, really trying to make a difference in this community, trying to provide services at basic cost, below cost, to make sure that the medical needs for people in the community, especially Hispanics in the community, were met. This also slowly started his active career as well within the civil rights movement. By 1946, he also became a chapter president for LULAC, really starting to make that difference and fighting for it. For him, questions such as the still present school segregation, poll taxes were really important. But also in his medical practice, he saw the need for veterans out of World War II, especially Hispanic, Mexican-American veterans that did not get services through Veterans Affairs, or not being served, or oftentimes even rejected. And he really realized that there needed to be change there. And this really, in a room at an elementary school in Corpus Christi, led to the formation of the American GI Forum. This organization, and you can see Dr. Garcia right here standing in front of the banner of the American GI Forum, was an organization that fought for educational and medical rights and benefits for Mexican-American veterans at this point. And you can see already in 1948, Dr. Garcia not only became the president of the American GI Forum, but ensured that this organization spread. By its first year, it already had several chapters throughout Texas. And Dr. Garcia was making speeches throughout, making sure that the rights of veterans were being recognized. Of all veterans were being recognized with that as well. Anything from hospital coverage to pensions would be included too. And so a lot of work, and this is the beginning of a very long career for Garcia to be an advocate and to be an activist for veterans' rights, but for his whole community as well. And these are some of my favorite pictures. When I was browsing through, I remember when we were building the exhibit and we knew Dr. Garcia was definitely going to be on our Texas Upstander wall. These were some of the pictures I remember going through that we were not able to put in the exhibit, but I just loved so much. And they tell so much about his story of activism as well. First of all, a big part of him becoming involved in the American GI Forum, also taking a forefront in the civil rights movement, was Garcia's involvement in the Felix Longoria case. You can actually see him standing many, many years later in 1989 at the Arlington National Cemetery by Longoria's gravesite as well. Felix Longoria was killed by a Japanese sniper in the Pacific Theater. His body was repatriated back to the United States. He was originally from a small town, and I'm making sure I got this town correct, Three Rivers, Texas, where the family tried to bury Private Longoria. And the funeral home refused this because although he was a veteran and had served his country and died in action serving his country, they would not bury him there because he was Mexican-American. And so this really brought the American GI Forum in to call out that this was not respectful, it was not honoring the rights of veterans, but to give them a proper burial. And Garcia brought this all the way to the attention of back then still Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who really brought this to the forefront and worked together with Garcia to get the recognition that and the proper burial that Longoria received. After years of work, Longoria was buried at the Arlington National Cemetery with all the honors of a proper military burial with that as well. And this just shows the man that Garcia was and the lengths that he was willing to go. Throughout his career, he became involved in other key civil rights cases, like the Hernandez versus Texas case, which really set the precedence of a jury of your peers in the sense of Hispanic rights and having a Hispanic jury of your peers as well, without not further instilling prejudice against Hispanics too. That case involved many other great upstanders as well, including our Texas upstander Gus Garcia, who's on our Texas upstander wall too. In the 1960s, he really started advocating for the Kennedy campaign and became very involved with democratic politics, being an activist in that spectrum as well. Kennedy eventually named him the alternate ambassador to the United Nations for the United States. And that also brought him to the forefront as a protest leader as well. And that's why I added this famous image of Dr. Garcia as well, actually with his sister at the protest of the murder of Jose Campos Torres, who was so severely beaten by actually Houston Police Department that he died after a disturbance arrest as well. And this really showed how actively he was involved in all parts of the community. And I actually had it on my previous slide, but nationally, Hector was recognized as well, eventually receiving probably the most highest recognition that there is in the United States for a civilian is the Medal of Freedom, which he received in 1984 from President Reagan. His legacy was in 1996, after suffering from cancer, Dr. Garcia died surrounded by his family, but he left a huge legacy behind. Now today, there's over 500 chapters of the American GI throughout, with over 150,000 members being part of it, still actively working towards veterans' rights as well. And I also want to say there's a big statue of him as well that has his motto as well on it, which I thought was so important to share too, is that education is our freedom and freedom should be everybody's business. And that just embodies everything Dr. Garcia stood for, is that fight for equal education for everybody, equal rights for everybody, and medical access for everybody is so important. So, of course, he can tell that better than me. So I want to leave you with a testimony that we also have in our exhibition as well, if you come visit us.
In 1947, 48, when I got back from the World War II services, and I came back and came to Corpus Christi and found out that there was a great amount of discrimination against the Mexican-American people. The American GI Forum didn't start as a civil rights organization. We started as a veterans family organization. Our main objective at that time was we found out that we want to help the veterans get to the hospitals. Well, then we started working on the education of the veterans. When you realized in 1946, when World War II was over, the average education level of the Mexican-American veteran was less than 2 years of schooling. So then we thought we had to do something about it, so we started working what you called at that time basic educational classes, to set up schools, to help the veteran go to first and second, third and fourth grade, and also get some money for going to school. It was at this time that I started finding out again how uneducated, how lack of opportunity of education the Mexican Americans had.
I'm now going to turn it back over to Sara for, I know, one of her favorite Upstanders.
Thank you, Charlotte. Okay, so Dr. Garcia is a hard act to follow. Oveta Culp Hobby, in her own way, working on behalf of women's right to serve their country, definitely leaves her own mark. And it's a substantial mark. So let me tell you about Mrs. Hobby. She was born in 1905. She was the second of 7 children of Ike and Emma Elizabeth Culp. She was born in Killeen, Texas. Her father was a lawyer and a state legislator. She was a very smart child, and she grew up in a family that was committed to public service. And one of the earliest stories that is told about her, and I'm working on this from a biography that was written by one of her 2 children, is that when she was 5 or 6 years old, there was a wave of fundamentalism that swept through, fundamentalist Protestantism that swept through Killeen, Texas. And it brought with it the plea for temperance, for sobriety in Killeen. And so the 5 and 6-year-olds at her church Sunday school were all asked to take the pledge being the Women Christian Temperance Union's pledge that they swore off drinking liquor. And in exchange for that, they would each one of these little children would receive a white ribbon. Well, Oveta Culp Hobby thought it over, and she refused to take the pledge, and she turned down the white ribbon. The reason that she gave was that she said she had no desire to drink liquor. Again, this is a little girl, but she might wish to when she got older, and she didn't want to put herself into the position of having to break her word. This is a strong little girl. Fast forward to the first time that she had any kind of major political experience. In 1919, when she was 14 years old, her father was elected to the Texas state legislature. And so she went with him to Austin and spent much of the time that the legislature was in session watching her father, meeting people, reading. She was a voracious reader. In spite of all of that, she graduated almost top in her class from Temple High School, even though she missed quite a bit of school. She then enrolled in college. She went to Mary Hardin Baylor College. She did not finish. She dropped out after 2 years. She subsequently began to study law at 2 different places in Texas, never finished either of those programs. And in 1925, at the age of 20, she was asked to become the Texas House of Representatives legislative parliamentarian. And that is the photo that you see in the lower left-hand corner. And the woman who is smack in the middle of this picture is Oveta Culp Hobby. So that's 1925. As I said, she's 20 years old. She has not finished college. She does not finish law school. What the legislative parliamentarian does is he or she, in this case, advises other members of the legislature on rules and regulations that govern the making of laws, the passing of laws, and behavior in general in the legislature. It's a remarkably heady position for somebody who was as young as she was. She stayed in that position until 1931. She also, while she was in that position, got involved in Democratic Party politics in Houston, and in fact left her position as a parliamentarian temporarily to work with the National Democratic Party conventions in 28, because it was held in Houston, and then she returned to the legislature and her parliamentary position. She also worked for Tom Connolly, who ran for U.S. Senate against a Klan-backed candidate. He won, and she in fact ran herself for office when she was 25 years old. She lost, but it left other people to say about her, particularly if her son is to be, her son's memory is accurate. The candidate who beat her said about her that she was 2 things. She was a parliamentarian and a Unitarian. You know, what a combination. Anyway, that was the end of her attempting to win public office. In 31, she re-met or took a second look at William P. Hobby. William Hobby had been a former governor of the state of Texas and was a close friend of her father's. She was 25, he was 53, and they got married in 31. And by all accounts, it was actually it was a marriage of love. It was a marriage of politics. It was a marriage of friendship. It worked on a whole series of levels, even though there was a 28-year age difference between the 2 of them. And she went on with former Governor Hobby to have 2 children. Once she married him, she went to work for the Houston Post-Dispatch. He was high up in the paper. By 1939, he had actually purchased the paper. And that really became, in many ways, a going family concern. Beyond that, he ultimately, with her advice as well, purchased a radio station. And she was in Washington, D.C. In 1941, before the war broke out, when there were a number of major figures within the Roosevelt administration and within the Army hierarchy who, thinking of a potential coming conflict, decided to ask Oveta Culp Hobby to look into forming some sort of a women's army. And the reason I say some sort of a women's army is because they're not clear on what they want. They don't really give her any kind of particularly good or clear guidance. And she initially turns them down. She returns from having met on getting permissions for their radio station to broadcast. She comes back to Houston. She talks to her husband, and her husband says, I think you need to do this. You need to serve, and the time is coming when all of us are going to have to serve. I'm paraphrasing his remarks. So she then puts together plans for what a women's army or a women's army corps could potentially look like. And she returns to Washington, D.C., and she testifies before Congress. And she is then approached by one of the Army's top generals who says, I want you to actually put into place and into operation this organization. And she goes back and forth. And again, her husband talks her into doing this. He says, I appreciate your family responsibilities, your care about the kids, but this needs to be done. And she ends up being appointed the director of what comes to be known as the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And the reason it's called the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps is because it is not considered part of the military. It's considered a civilian volunteer operation on the side. And this photo here in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of Mrs. Hobby being sworn in as the director of the WAC organization. And then this picture in the lower right-hand corner is a picture of her in uniform. What's fascinating about her early uniform is that there were no women's uniforms. She had to personally design her own uniform. And there are stories about her as the director of the WAC traveling around the United States to recruit other women to join the organization, to talk to male military supervisors in an effort to get them to take these women in to do jobs that they're trained to do and that they should be able to do. And there are no uniforms for her. So she makes her own uniform, and they talk about her at the end of every day coming home, washing her own uniform, hanging it up to dry, and then ironing it so she can put it on again in the morning to go back out and do more recruiting. Charlotte, can we turn to the next page, please? Thank you. So this is a picture of a series of recruitment posters and then actual members of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in the field. So the recruitment poster is on the left-hand side with two samples of the types of activities that WACs undertook. And they did everything from cooking to working as mechanics to delivering mail. I mean, it was a fascinating business, because when she took over, there were approximately 50 to 54 different positions that women were allowed to hold. By the time, and there was a thought that about 25,000 women would potentially be used by this Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. By the time the war ends, it ceased to be the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. It's become the Women's Army Corps. It's now actually considered a branch of the Army. It is not an outside civilian volunteer operation. And instead of doing 54 Army jobs, which are the specialties that women were initially going to be allowed to do, by the time Colonel Hobby, because she has now been promoted when it ceases to be the auxiliary and becomes the Women Army Corps, she is promoted to colonel and becomes the director of now WAC with a single A. There's now 239 different positions that, or jobs, what in the military today you would call an MOS, that women can do. The thought originally, as I said, was that about maybe 25,000 women would be recruited to these operations. Ultimately, by 1944, the WAC headquarters has requests for 600,000 berths to be filled by women. Ultimately, there are 150,000 women who move in and out of the Women's Army Corps as they do the various positions. And what you'll see here in the center photo is, that's Oveta Culp Hobby in the right of the photo, talking to two of the women who work in the Women's Army Corps. She's an extremely attractive woman, which probably doesn't hurt in terms of having to deal with a lot of men in the military in positions of authority. There are all kinds of ginned up scandals that surround the WACs, but I say ginned up because they're nonsense. In some of the early postings for women, the area, if they're put on a base, is completely surrounded by a fence. Women are regulated in terms of when they can go in and out of the regular base. They're only allowed to go to the mess hall when there's no men eating there. They're only allowed to watch movies on the base on nights when the men aren't going to be in the theater, because clearly women who do this work are sexualized and there's something wrong with them. And this is just a small part of some of the nonsense that floated around all of this. By the time she steps down from the Women's Army Corps in July of 1945, so she steps down a little bit before the war ends, her hair has turned white. She's got streaks of white. I mean, this was an incredibly rough position, but she did it exceptionally well, and she brought women into the military in a way that they had simply never been, that had never been viewed as possible. So she didn't just stand up for herself, she stood up for the women who were underneath her command, and she just did a spectacular job. When she left the Army Corps, her husband met her on the train. They travel into New York, and he signs her into a hospital for a week or more so that she can recover, because she's absolutely exhausted. She then travels back with him to Houston, resumes her work at the Post, their newspaper. And in 1952, when Eisenhower runs for president as a Republican, she, Oveta Culp Hobby, and her husband, William Hobby, both lifelong Democrats, work for Eisenhower's election because they're unhappy with FDR's New Deal and how far it went, because they're both convinced that it went farther than they were comfortable with. Eisenhower obviously is elected, and in 1953, he brings her to Washington, and she is appointed the first secretary, and so a member of his cabinet, but the first secretary of the Health, Education, and Welfare, the HEW agency. She stays there through 1955. And then she steps down, and she returns to Houston to be with her family, and also to spend time with her husband, because her husband is going into his final illness. He dies in the mid-60s. And she spends the rest of her life serving on boards, doing all kinds of unpaid public service positions, plus working at the Post. She, for a woman who never actually finished college, she gets close to a dozen honorary degrees that she collects over the years. It's really, really amazing. And she passes away in 1995. Charlotte, can we go to the next page, please? So these are photos of her with Governor Hobby on the left, a photo of her traveling as the director of WAC in 1942 with Eleanor Roosevelt to England. A photo from 53 when she's being sworn in with Eisenhower in the room as the secretary of HEW. A photo from later in her life when she has left DC and gone back to the Houston Post. And now one more slide, please, Charlotte. And here is Oveta Culp Hobby's testimony about her work and why she did what she did.
This word to you is in a sense a hail and farewell. A farewell to the members of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and a hail to the members of the Women's Army Corps. You have written a fine page in the history of women at war, in this war of survival. There are other pages to write before we can say as women, mission accomplished. We must accept the leadership of those responsible for the success of our army. This means that we may not always work at the job for which we feel we are best fitted. The jobs we do, whether exciting or dull, must be done. Which one of us is prepared to say, my work is unimportant? There is a deep satisfaction in saying to your country in its hour of need, here am I, use me. All your strength to the task at hand, all your help to victory.
Thank you, Charlotte. Before we go any further, there's two questions that have been asked that I wanted to answer. I'll start with number two because that's the easier one, and then I'll answer number one. So question number two is, was the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps affiliated with the Women's Air Service pilots? And the answer is no. They were separate. They were under separate branches of the military in terms of how they functioned. And the interesting thing about the WASPs is that the WASPs were pilots. And so they were in their own way, they were a much more elite group. So the two groups were not connected. I am looking up what happened to the USS West Virginia, and it looks like it was decommissioned January 9th, 1947. So it ended its military career shortly after the war, and then it was it says fate on Wikipedia. It was sold for scrap, I'm sorry to say, August 24th, 1959. So that therein ends its career. It was also not the only ship that was sunk at Pearl that was refloated. There were a few of them that went down in shallower water, and they were able to reclaim them. Charlotte, anything to add?
Not on my end. I just wanted to say, I'll put it in the chat as well, is you can leave your questions in the Q&A if you have any questions using that Q&A button. So if you have any more questions for us, you can use that Q&A.
I also, Charlotte and Caroline and I were talking about this before we started the program, about how fitting it is that we're doing this program this week, considering the fact that November 11th is Veterans Day. All three of the people, the upstanders we focused on today, were veterans. If there are any of you who are in the audience today and you are veterans, we wanted to thank you very much for your service. And the reason, as long as we're here, for those of you who don't know, the reason Veterans Day is historically on November 11th is because it originally in the United States marked Armistice Day. So the 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918 is when the armistice for World War I was signed. That was the war to end all wars. So that was called Armistice Day. Then, God help us, we had another world war, which was the war to end all wars. And so this became Veterans Day, no longer Armistice Day. And this morning, driving into the museum, I was listening to the last 15 minutes of a 2-hour program from Hollywood, a radio program that was broadcast in August of 1945, after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but before the Japanese signing of the unconditional surrender and the sign off of all of these Hollywood stars who had been part of this. Isn't it wonderful? The war is over, and thank you for your heroism, and all of this was. And now we say to the world, peace is upon us. And I found myself saying to the radio, you are so wrong, and I really wish you were right. But it's very interesting that every time a war ends, this is where we, as Americans, we like to think, okay, this is it. We're done. It's settled. This will never happen again. And unfortunately, it doesn't. It hasn't worked that way. Let me put it that way. Maybe it will at some point. So.
Okay. I don't think we have any further questions coming in, so I'm going to wish everybody a very great evening. And I want to also invite you to come visit our museum and come look at all of the other Texas Upstanders on our Upstander wall as well, to learn more about them too, and to come see our 3 Upstanders that we discussed tonight as well. And also a quick reminder that on Sundays, our amazing docents do provide guided tours and can also share more information about these Upstanders too. So have a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you at the museum.
Good night.
Night.